Information is an incredibly strong tool in Yu-Gi-Oh! Knowledge of the meta and the cards the best decks are playing gives you an edge over other duelists, especially at the competitive level where your skill at evaluating the cards that could be in your opponent's hand or deck can be the difference between losing a match or winning a YCS. But knowing is only half the battle, because while information is important, using cards solely for the purpose of gaining knowledge is at best unnecessary and a waste of cards. Which is why they're the topic of today's video, exploring why spy cards are a redundant part of the modern game, why the info they provide isn't enough, and what cards that allow you to gain knowledge need to do in order to see use in the modern era. In Yu-Gi-Oh! There are two types of information on the game state a player could have access to. There's public knowledge and private knowledge. Public knowledge is information that's available to both players at all times. This includes the number of life points each player has, the stats and effects of face-up cards on the field, in the graveyard, and in the face-up banishment, as well as the number of cards in each player's hands, decks, extra decks, graveyards, and banishment. Spy cards should never really have any kind of impact on the public knowledge that you have available to you, as at any point if you want to know these pieces of information, all you have to do is just ask. Private knowledge, on the other hand, is only available to one player and includes pretty much everything else, from the name cards you have in your hand and deck, to face-down cards you saw in your field or in your banishment. But it's important to note that private knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't aware of what the card is. For example, if your opponent only has one card in hand and it's reinforcements of the army, then if they use it to search for an exiled force, then even though it's entered a private knowledge location, you'll have a good idea of the last card in their hand. And it's figuring out private information where spy cards have the potential to be invaluable. Everybody's had at least one game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you've had an amazing hand, but your opponent was able to blindside you with the one deck that beats you, or they happen to have the perfect hand trap or board breaker to counter what you're going for, which are two factors you don't have any control over or any knowledge of. And that's why spy cards are so appealing. If you know the deck that your opponent is playing, or if you can get knowledge on the exact cards they have in hand, you're aware of every possible variation that could change the outcome of a duel, which allows you to customize the way you play, based on the factors that you know, rather than needing to gamble with a guess. And interestingly enough, there are a ton of spy cards currently on the ban list, but not the ban list we're familiar with, and not the Master Duel or OCG ban list either. Cards like Destiny Hero Dominance and Goddess Gold Oracle are specifically on the remote duel ban list because these cards are designed to tell you the cards on the top of your opponent's deck without giving them a chance to see it, which you can do in real life pretty easily, but it's a lot more awkward to do when you can't physically touch your opponent's cards. So it's just a lot easier to have these cards banned. However, despite how ban-worthy these cards might be in remote duels, investing cards solely for the purpose of gathering info is usually completely unnecessary. A spy card might help you figure out how to conceptually beat the cards in your opponent's possession, but they don't do anything to help you mechanically, because even if you know for a fact that Ash Blossom or Effect Builder is in your opponent's hand, you might not have the means to play through it, which then makes the info that you gained pretty much worthless when you have to pass back to your opponent on an empty board when your best starter is ashed anyway. In fact, it might even have been worse than worthless, because the card you gave up to check the cards in your opponent's hand or deck could have been an extra way to play through or beat a card or strategy that you were worried about in the first place. But even if you have a hand that was already capable of playing around the card that beat you, spending a resource just to check if they have it isn't really worth it when you could instead use your knowledge of the current format to take an educated guess on whether or not they have the card. If you know that Ghost Ogre is an effective card against you and a played card in the current format, for example, you're best just playing around it anyways. Now, there's no guarantee that your assumptions are always going to be correct, but learning how to use your knowledge of a format and how to read your opponent's plays means you'll never need to spend a card just for information. That's not to say getting information is bad though. If you can get free knowledge on your opponent's hand or deck as a bonus, that undoubtedly gives you a crazy advantage. But if all a card does is give you information, it's not worth playing when you can instead rely on your dueling instinct. But pure instinct isn't enough. It has to be backed up by genuine knowledge. So let's dig into some of the game's most iconic spy cards to explore not just what makes them terrible, but how the knowledge they provide could potentially help, and how we can get it through other means, starting off with Ancient Telescope. Ancient Telescope's effect is extremely simple. All it does is let you look at the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck. You don't get to rearrange them or put them on the bottom of their deck if you think they're too good, you just get to look. This is an absolutely terrible effect, since you're just wasting a card to confirm the deck that your opponent is playing. It's a straight -1 and doesn't have any kind of immediate impact to change the game state in your favor. It's essentially a card that is guaranteed to do next to nothing when it's activated, which makes it a lot harder to make or break a board when you might as well be missing a card from your hand if you happen to draw Telescope. It doesn't even have utility when going second either, as by the time you get to activate it, you'll likely be aware of the strategy your opponent is playing. However, the information that Ancient Telescope gives you theoretically isn't bad. In fact, you can leverage quite a bit of advantage by looking at the cards in your opponent's deck to learn their next draw, the generic options they play, and most importantly, the archetype and engine pieces that they're on. If you're aware of these things, you don't gain any sort of instant advantage, but you can change the way you play based on your understanding of the archetype you're up against to help you win a duel. But you don't need to spend a card to gain that advantage. You just have to do one of the hardest things possible for any Yu-Gi-Oh player: read the cards. Because if you set up on a format and learn the best decks in it and how they play, you can use that information to help you succeed even if you're not playing one of the best decks yourself. Since if you know how to play the best decks, then you know the best hand traps and board breakers to use, the best places to interact, and most effective end boards to build against them, and because in a competitive environment the most popular decks are the best ones, knowing them and building your deck around beating them is going to give you an edge. But even if you're not against one of the best decks, the moment that they reveal what they're playing, you can change the way you've used your interactions or even in the cards in your main deck by swapping them out with cards you have in your side deck in games 2 and 3 to better suit the rogue strategy you're against, which is even more effective if you also happen to know how exactly the deck plays too. This is a huge part of what makes Ancient Telescope so redundant compared to having foundational knowledge of a given format. You might be able to confirm without a doubt the deck that your opponent is on, but if you don't know how that deck plays, then you don't really gain anything for what Ancient Telescope would show you. Especially because once you go into games 2 and 3 of a full match, or if you happen to go second, you'll likely be well aware of what deck your opponent is on by then anyways, which strictly limits the interesting use of a card like Telescope specifically to the very first turn of a duel to tell you what deck you're up against. But figuring this out is also possible by combining your knowledge of the format with the decks that you know best by analyzing the public information of the number of cards in your opponent's deck and extra deck that you can predict the strategy that they're on before they activate a single card. A really obvious example of this is a deck like Domain Monarch or True Draco, which won't be playing an expansive extra deck, if any extra deck at all, so they can take advantage of their strong cards. So in a competitive environment, if you see that your opponent has no extra deck, you can make a solid assumption of the strategy they're playing. The same is sometimes true of the main deck count too. Most strategies generally try to play 40 cards for the sake of consistency. So when a deck plays more than 40 in a competitive environment, there's usually some really good reason behind it that pertains specifically to that deck. Branded, for example, is a strategy that has a ton of different but uniquely powerful engine pieces that can help you build an absurd board or push through an opponent's. But it's pretty difficult to squeeze these engine pieces into just 40 cards. So often, branded pilots will shoot for 40, 50, or even sometimes 60 just to ensure their engine is as strong as it can be. Likewise, in any format where that grass looks greener is legal in any capacity, you might see meal-focused graveyard strategies such as Tearlaments or Paleo try to take advantage of a card by playing 60, so that if they find a way to grass, they'll drown an advantage by milling 20 or more cards from the top of their deck. But what if we aren't trying to figure out what cards are in our opponent's deck? What if you were instead trying to figure out the cards in their hand? Well, in that case, you'd need the help of a spy, but instead of double helix or gravekeepers, you might be forced to rely on the help of the inexperienced spy. This spell card has an absurdly simple effect that allows you to choose a card in your opponent's hand and look at it. And that's about it. Once again, this is undoubtedly awful. Spy forces you to waste a card for an effect that doesn't have any kind of immediate advantage, and the knowledge it gives you is going to be worthless if you can't combo off. Especially because Spy doesn't even show you a lot of information since you only get to look at a single card. As a result, it's pretty unlikely that Spy is ever going to be incidentally useful. Because even if you get to see a card with Spy that might show that they have ways to interact with your combo, not only do you only get to see 1/5 of what your opponent has access to, meaning they could have more than you don't even know about, but because Spy doesn't do anything to actually deal with the card your opponent has, you still need a way to beat the card since they're going to end up using it against you anyways. And if that card is fairly common in the metagame anyway, you should be doing your best to play around it regardless of whether or not you know if it's in your opponent's hand, since it's more than likely it'll come up, which means that Spy often isn't going to actually change the way you play. However, despite how bad Spy is, just like with Ancient Telescope, it's not like the information is bad, because figuring out what could be in your opponent's hand can actually help you win a ton of duels. But once again, it's usually better to rely on your instinct as a duelist and what you know about a format to assume what's going to be in your opponent's hand. Because analyzing the best decks of the format, you can get a better understanding of not just their playstyles, but of the generic tools that they're most likely to use, as well as the ones that are most effective against them. If the best deck around is one that regularly struggles against Bystials, for example, then more decks are going to be playing them to counter it, which means that in any given duel, it's more likely than usual that your opponent is going to have one in hand. So if your deck also happens to be hurt by Bystials, you need to be a lot more cautious about how you play your turns, with the assumption that you can get hit with a Magma Hut looming over your head, which gives you a greater incentive to try and beat and play around them, both within a duel and when deck building. Likewise, by knowing the most common staples in a format, you're also made aware of the ones that you don't actually need to worry about too much. A card like Kinetic Puppeteer could be a turn-ending hand trap against your strategy. But if you know that people aren't even considering the card, let alone playing it, then it doesn't make sense to assume that it could be one of the cards in your opponent's hand and that you have to play around it. This kind of knowledge technically doesn't confirm the cards that are in your opponent's hand like Spy would, but instead it tells you what is and isn't more likely to be used against you, so that you can alter your strategy and game plan to play around the cards with the highest potential to be there, which is a lot more reliable and will win you more duels than drawn into your inexperienced Spy ever could. But it's not just knowledge of the format that can help with this, as the way that your opponent plays out of their turn can also help to signal cards they have access to. A great example actually takes place in Edison format, where battle tricks like Collude and limiter removal are pretty common. So if you see that your opponent is attacking into your Stardust Dragon with a Lila, then that signals your opponent probably has Honest in hand, so they can beat over it, since it doesn't make much sense for them to crash their own monster for no reason, and with that knowledge in mind, you can consider using a Book of Moon on Lila to keep your monster on the field. This same style of thinking is often applied in the modern era too, but for different cards, since battle tricks don't really see much play anymore. Here's a great case study. Your opponent is on pure Snake Eyes and summons Diabellstar the Black Witch by sending a copy of Bonfire from their hand to the grave, and then uses Diabellstar's effect to set a wanted Seeker the Sinful Spoils directly from their deck. This one action actually signals a lot about your opponent's hand, but only so long as you know the deck. Pitching Bonfire means that your opponent likely has another way of accessing Snake Eyes Ash. And the fact that Witch set a copy of Wanted almost guarantees that they have an original Sinful Spoils in their hand already, since it's the usual target for Black Witch to set. These 2 points of information can then influence how you interact with the deck. If you have an Ash Blossom in this scenario, you might have initially wanted to use it on the original Sinful Spoils that you know was already in their hand, but because they sent Bonfire, it means that they likely have another route to Snake Eyes Ash and subsequently Poplar as well. So instead, you can hold on to the Ash for a moment where it's going to have more impact, like a Snake Eyes Ash second effect, to try to cut off the access to Flameberg. This is only one specific situation, but being able to read between the lines of a game state by combining your deck knowledge with how an opponent plays out a turn will not only strengthen you as a player, but lead you to winning more games as a result, since you can save your best interactions for where they're most needed. It's just a shame that Duel Academy isn't around in real life to teach us about every possible game state. But thankfully, the more you play a format, the easier it becomes to understand certain strategies. But it's for these reasons cards like Inexperienced Spy and other similar options are just pretty redundant. The information you know is going to be helpful in some capacity, but without these cards doing more than just giving you information, it's much more beneficial to instead rely on your intuition so that the card you would spend on checking out your opponent's hand can instead be something to actually beat the cards they do have. Even if you have a card like Mind Haxor's, which actually reveals a ton of information, doesn't do much to influence a duel in your favor. With Haxor, you get to see every card in your opponent's hand and the cards set in their field too, so long as you pay 500 life points, which can technically help in trying to play around certain trap-based interactions and floodgates before your opponent gets a chance to flip them. But just like the Inexperienced Spy, what you reveal with Haxor isn't going to help you unless you already have a way of playing through it. Because while Haxors could end up revealing Synchro Zone, Rivalry, and Skill Drain that your opponent has set, you're likely to prefer a copy of Harpy's Feather Duster instead. But despite how easy it is to say that Ancient Telescope, the Inexperienced Spy, and similar cards are all terrible, there are a ton of strong spy cards throughout the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! So much so that a lot of them didn't just see competitive play, they ended up getting banned for how strong they were. And the reason why these cards are so good is because they do just a little bit more than giving information. The easiest and most busted example of these are the hand rip cards, Confiscation, the Forceful Sentry, and Triple Tactics Talents. Hand ripping is usually a pretty toxic effect as a whole, whether or not you get any knowledge out of it, especially if you can deal with multiple cards from your opponent's hand, which can prevent them from playing at all. But while cards like Sentry and Confiscation won't be able to clear away an entire hand, they can remove the best card from your opponent's hand with surgical precision by letting you see the cards in their hand before you choose which one to send. dealing with their most effective option before they ever get a chance to use it against you, whether it's Pot of Greed in GOAT format or Nibiru in the modern era. Then, because of the knowledge you've gained from your opponent's hand, you're 100% aware of what you now need to play around, which gives you an absurd advantage over an opponent, letting you play more aggressively when you know they don't have a Chaos Sorcerer to summon, or more carefully now that you've seen Heavy Storm. And that's why cards like Confiscation and Sentry are probably never going to have a chance to return from the ban list in the modern era, especially with a card like Tactics around, a card that can be used in the exact same way as Sentry, but can only do so if a monster effect has been activated by your opponent during your main phase. Even with this restriction, Talents is still incredibly busted for the exact same reasons as its older counterparts, because its condition isn't that hard to fulfill given how common hand traps are in the modern era. And even though they'll get a chance to use the hand trap before you get to use Talents, you'll then get to punish them by shuffling back their best starter while keeping your interactions ready for whatever else you know they have. But a Spy card doesn't even need to rip cards from your opponent's hand to be strong. So long as they're still doing something a little bit extra, then the information they give is still valuable. And nowhere is that more apparent than in Spiral, a fittingly named strategy centered around learning the top card of your opponent's deck. You can do this a couple of ways with the effect of Drone to see and rearrange the top cards of their deck, or even just a gamble with Super Agent, so long as you can figure it out by the time you summon Spiral Double Helix, which can summon out any Spiral monster from your deck if you can guess the type of card on top of your opponent's deck. Now of course, the main benefit of knowing this is that you get to take advantage of one of the most busted archetypal link monsters in the game's history. But even just getting to know your opponent's top deck can give you valuable information on the deck you're playing, which lets you pivot your plays into making the most effective end board that you can against your opponent. Especially so if you get to rearrange the top 3 cards of the deck to give them the worst possible draw. But it wasn't just Spiral that could rearrange the top cards of your opponent's deck, as back when it was legal, Mystic Mind strategies would specifically take advantage of Goddess Skuld Oracle because, like Drone, it would let you see and rearrange the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck. This had a ton of immediate applications. With Mine Up, you could keep your opponent away from their Cosmic Cyclone or Harpy's Feather Duster every single turn, ensuring that it was going to take them forever to actually deal with Mystic Mine, which give you plenty of turns to draw into set up protection, while establishing your win condition before your opponent ever had the chance to draw the out. But in terms of modern formats, some of the best cards that give you free information within recent memory are the Kashtira monsters. Kashtira Unicorn is a crazy starter both when used generically and within Kashtira, as it allows you to search for either Kashtira Theosis to extend more Kashtira monsters from your deck, or Birth, which can be used to special summon Kashtira monsters from your grave, or face-up banishment. But if your opponent activates a monster effect, or you declare an attack with Unicorn, you get to check out every card in their extra deck and choose one to banish face down. Like with the hand rip cards, the best part about this effect is that you get to deal with your opponent's best options before they have an opportunity to use them. In fact, some strategies are so reliant on having specific extra deck cards available to them that if Unicorn is ever around in a format, sometimes a deck will play 2 copies of this same extra deck monster just to ensure that Unicorn won't prevent access to it. But even though removing this option is really strong, getting to see your opponent's extra deck is a great bonus. Because if you know the cards in their extra, not only do you get a good idea of the cards they're playing in the main deck, but you also get to know the cards your opponent is trying to get into when they push into your board, allowing you to more easily beat a potential Baguska or SP Little Knight, even if you don't rip it purely because you'll be able to see them coming more easily. Unicorn isn't the only information gathering card within the Kashtira archetype, because while Ogre is a little bit weaker since it can only grab trap cards with its search effect, its effect whenever it attacks or when your opponent uses a monster effect pretty much power creeps Ancient Telescope, since it lets you reveal the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck and then banish one of them face down. You don't get a chance to change the order of these cards, but you do potentially get to make an opponent top deck a little bit worse or damage an engine by banishing an important card from their deck, all while still getting some solid info on your opponent's strategy. These are just a couple of examples of cards that give you free information on your opponent's deck that have proved themselves to be viable. But there are a ton of others that exist that will appear in different formats. From the Virus Trap cards that lets Labyrinth check out your opponent's hand and their subsequent draws while popping a specific type of card, to Neospace and Aqua Dolphin being a great engine piece for Infernoble, as it allowed you to scout your opponent's hand for hand traps and potentially rip them out before you linked it off into a Soul Day because it happened to be a warrior. So with all of that being said, is it really fair to say spy cards are really a failed mechanic? Well, sort of. Getting access to private information as a bonus to an already strong card just makes it even better by giving you free knowledge that can be used more effectively to counter an opponent, whether you reveal their hand, deck, or extra deck, and in that regard, the mechanic is actually quite successful. But in terms of cards whose sole purpose is to gather information and nothing else, they are undoubtedly failed cards. Because even though the information they can give you is valuable, it doesn't do enough to help you by itself. So it's much more viable to instead rely on your knowledge of a format, your skills as a deck builder, and your instinct as a duelist to play around the threats your opponent could have while still putting up an impressive board. But spy cards as a whole aren't in a terrible spot. Cards that incidentally provide you with free information are actually pretty great so long as they come with good primary effects. More modern spying options have some solid utility, and cards like Talents or even Unicorn are going to see viable competitive success so long as they're legal. Which means that while we're long past the days where Mind Haxar would be considered even in the most casual of decks, spy cards have a great future ahead of them. And that's the video. If you think of any other bad spy cards I may have missed, or any other ways to potentially make information gathering stronger, or if you know any other cards and mechanics may have failed, please let us know down in the comments below.